Welcome, everyone, to Barker Gilmore's webinar, Do I Want to Become a Public Company GC? I am Michelle Banks, currently a Senior Advisor at Barker Gilmore and formerly a 10-year public company General Counsel. Over the course of my legal career, I worked in-house at 2 public and 1 private company. I will introduce our other 2 speakers and then kick us off by summarizing our goal in offering this webinar and some factors that impact a public company general counsel role. We encourage you to submit questions at any time during this webinar. Please use the Zoom Q&A function. Your questions will be anonymous to us. We will allow at least 15 minutes at the end of this program to answer them, and we will seek to answer as many questions as possible. I am thrilled that joining me today to discuss the differences between public and private company general counsel roles and what boards look for in public company candidates are 2 other panelists. Carolyn Herzog, who is currently general counsel of a very large private tech company, ARM Limited, which is a subsidiary of a Japanese public company, SoftBank. Carolyn was previously Deputy General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer of public tech company Symantec. Our special thanks to Carolyn for taking the time to be with us on this webinar. We are also joined by my colleague, John Gilmore. John is a co-founder and managing partner of Barker Gilmore. He focuses on placing general counsel and their successors at both public and private companies. The goal of this webinar is to help you decide whether or not you are truly interested in a public company GC role. Public definitely sounds good to many people, but there are a number of negative things you should take into consideration as well. It's a tough job, take it from me. I think I aged in dog years when I was a GC. It involves a lot of public pressure. I think it's important to go in with your eyes wide open. On the other hand, there are definitely a lot of positive things, including compensation and the prestige of the job. We would like to help you prepare and position yourself if becoming a public company GC is something you want to achieve, or to feel good about your decision if it's not. The role of a public company general counsel is impacted by many factors. Just a few: Securities and Exchange Commission rules, stock exchange rules, shareholder activism, proxy advisor reports, board and independent director requirements, ESG, or the environmental, societal, and governance expectations, expectations of external auditors, heightened media scrutiny, class action targeting, and ethics requirements. These are just a few of the many considerations. I'd now like to hear from John and Carolyn's perspectives on these and other impacts on the difference between operating as a public and a private company GC. John, welcome. Let's start with you. In your experience, what key qualities and experiences do CEOs look for when seeking private company general counsel candidates?
That's a great question. And first of all, I'd like to just acknowledge the fact that whether you become the general counsel of a private company or a public company, it's quite an accomplishment, and it's not an easy task to achieve. So either way, we're not trying to position one as being better than the other. They're just very different. The core competencies that we look for when we're doing a search, whether it's a general counsel or general counsel of a public or private company, are pretty much the same. There are differences, obviously, with the public company experience necessary to sit in the public company general counsel seat, but the core elements are those that you typically don't find on a resume. So we have broken it down. We have a 6-point assessment process here at Barker Gilmore, and these 6 points we use no matter whether it's private or public. So number 1 is emotional intelligence. The person really has to be able to react well in stressful situations, be able to form good relationships, become a strategic advisor, It really makes a difference of how they're going to react in these stressful situations. 2 is judgment. The GC is going to serve as the ethical compass of the company. So inside and outside of the office, judgment has to be nothing but perfect. 3 is leadership abilities. Are they able to mentor, hire, train, and retain talent? 4 is risk tolerance. Does their risk tolerance align with the risk tolerance of the executive team? If there's a balance that's missing there, needless to say, the long-term fit isn't going to work. 5 is the legal and business acumen. Whether you're private company or public company, our clients are looking for people that understand the business, have financial acumen, and they're able to make some sound calls as far as the business growing and the direction the business takes. And then number 6 is the cultural fit. Do they have the right fit? Is it the right chemistry to match the executive team and the organization's overall culture?
Thank you. That was great, John. What additional skills or experiences do boards look for when seeking a public company general counsel candidate in your experience?
Boards put a heavy emphasis on a person's experience with corporate governance. They want to know that the person in that seat isn't learning on the job, but has firsthand experience knowing how to work with a board and knowing the difference between good governance and bad governance. So the public company experience is critically important when we're looking for a public company GC. It's not a very easy task for a private company GC to automatically move into a public company situation. It's really that exposure to the board. And a lot of times that exposure to the board can happen if you're assistant corporate secretary or the corporate secretary, or if you are in a position, for example, compliance, someone who's a chief compliance officer has great exposure to the overall board and the audit committee. So those are 2 different routes for people to take to get the experience that the board's looking for.
What are public company general counsel candidate do's and don'ts in interviews from your perspective, John? What do you see that works well, and what do you see that causes you to say, oh no?
Oh, that is another good question. I really don't think I can say there's a difference in approach for the interview itself, whether it's a public company or a private company. We counsel everyone before they help coach or prep people before they go in for their interviews. And my prep is the exact same whether you're going in for a public or private company. Obviously, for a public company, you need to have the experience dealing directly with the board and guiding the board. So you need to come in with firsthand examples of how you've had that kind of interface and the relationships that you've been able to establish. But I can just tell you that the majority of the times I put people out in interviews, and I'm only putting people on interviews who I have 100% confidence could go in and do the job. And you know that television show, Kids Do the Darndest Things? I can write a book when I'm done with this career. General counsel can do the darndest things. It's amazing how sitting general counsel will go into interviews and say or do things that automatically eliminate them. And I would say one thing, everybody has that buzzword out there. We're looking for a strategic advisor. And probably the number one thing that somebody can do wrong is talk too much on their interview. If you come across as someone who talks too much or isn't humble, it just comes across as someone who's not going to be a good business partner. So that's a big thing. People, when you're asked the question, why are you interested in this opportunity? They really need to understand something about the business and have some passion for the business. You really need to do your homework. I have some GCs go on interviews that think that they can just rest on their own merits and not have to prepare for the interviews. It sounds quite elementary, but it's amazing the people that go in and not really have a full appreciation or understanding of how the business makes their money. So that's another major situation. I would just say too is people who try too hard on the interviews and talk too much about themselves and why they're the perfect fit for the job just doesn't fit. It just really has to be a good natural chemistry between the individual and the executive team. And I think the person who asks the right questions, listens to the answers, and then responds to those answers with, what makes them a good fit, or talk about your reputation, meaning your reputation is what others think of you. Your identity is what you think of yourself. And I really recommend people on these interviews, they go in and they talk in terms of what if others had to say about you? What does your executive team, or what does the business leaders have to say about you? And that really drives a person getting an offer versus someone coming in and saying, I think I'm this. What is your greatest strength? Never start with, I think I'm this. It really should be, what have others had to say? So those are a few things. A lot of it is, like I say, it's the chemistry. The other, I've just finished with this, is talking about someone who talks too much, is you want to, make sure that you go in and just be yourself and let them get to know you. So somebody, for example, who goes in, gives credit where credit's due, meaning who's been your mentor, who's really the type of person who's helped get you to where you are today, and let them get to know who you are, share some information about the family and so forth, and really just get to know who you are as a person. That tends to work best.
That was really helpful, John. Now let's get down to business. What is the compensation differential between private and public company general counsel roles? You made the point that one is not necessarily better than the other. We're not here to advocate one or the other. We're trying to give people a realistic sense of what the jobs are and how to get them. But what would you say the compensation differential is?
Well, the compensation differential can be significant. If anyone goes on our site, you can see we have two forms of content that we prepare for general counsel compensation. One is we internally put out a salary survey to private and public company general counsel, and we take those results and we take the data and share that data. The other is we're a partner, we have been for probably the last 5 years, of Equilar. And what we do there is we take all public company NEOs, the named executive officers, and that's real compensation. So we're not asking people for them to be open and honest, but that's real legitimate compensation. And so our Barker Gilmore survey shows that the difference between private and public company can be 35% difference at the higher end, meaning companies more than $5 billion, and companies less than $500 million. Our research last year came back that it was 62% higher at a public company than a private company. That said, if you look at the top 50 public company NEOs, the top 50 public company general counsel who are then named an NEO, I guarantee a lot of them aren't filling out our salary survey and sending it back in. And those numbers can totally skew the whole thing. So if I look at companies bigger than $5 billion, that number is much greater than the number that I just shared. So if you look at the top 50 public company NEOs, the total cash comp for that top 50 is 1.9 million to 8 million. That's the cash compensation. And if you look at the total compensation for the top 50, it ranges from $2 million on the low end to 23 million on the high end. And if you break it down one step further, if I look at the top 10 public company NEOs compensation, you look at a total cash compensation from 4 million to 8 million. And then if I look at the next 40 down, so that's only the top 10. And if I look at the next 40 in line, that cash compensation goes from 1.9 million to 3.9 million. So the numbers can be significant. Most people come to us looking for the public company GC. Most private companies that are interested in the public company GC, it is because of that lack of equity. You see, like, for example, on the high end, the $8 million cash compensation general counsel made a total of $23 million last year. So $15 million just in the equity payout. So the equity awards can be significant, and that really drives the difference.
My last, but an important initial question for you, John. From a succession planning standpoint, something you and I share a passion for, What should a public company general counsel do differently in their senior most level talent development if they are trying to groom their successor for their job?
Well, in both cases, whether it's private or public company, the general counsel needs to get that direct exposure of the potential successors to the executive team and board. Without that, there's not a chance. The difference is a private company general counsel can do something, for example, let me put someone off as a division general counsel where they're supporting the business, getting to know the business, and the executive team gets to see the results. Or I've seen the deputy or the successor move into, say, a business leadership role, and again, gain exposure to the executive team and the board. In the public company, I don't often see the division general counsel, so the division general counsel, for example, of Latin America, they're out there in the business, they're away from that executive team and the board. They really don't come with that high level corporate experience that the board's looking for. So it's a little bit of a difference as far as if you are a successor for a public company, you really need a higher level corporate exposure and that corporate governance experience with the board, where in a public company, it's really someone who really knows the business, is servicing the business well, has all of the other soft skills that I mentioned in the first question. That person has a really great shot at becoming the general counsel.
So thank you, John. I'd now like to bring Carolyn into our conversation. Welcome, Carolyn. And my first question for you is, in your experiences at companies where you've worked in-house, what were the primary differences working in a public versus a private company law department?
So, well, thank you very much for having me today. I think the first big difference is really that quarterly cadence. In a public company, everything drives to the quarter. Whether you're working in sales, whether you're working in the corporate department, you're working in the compliance department, there is a rigor and there are resources that are just applied to that cadence. You have a familiarity with the requirements and the necessity to drive to the reporting. There is a sense of urgency around that reporting, and there are roles dedicated to that quarterly cadence. So you really feel that. Although in a private company, you're still quarterly driven, there is a machine that's still driving to that quarter. You just don't have that rigor, and you just don't have that drive and necessity around the quarter. Even the board reporting or that feeling around what you're doing with the board, you won't even necessarily have the cadence around the board and the quarter that you would in a public company. So that's the thing that you really feel is very, very different. You won't have that sense of data-driven reporting and even some of the roles that you would have in a public company.
So Carolyn, from your perspective, what were some of the advantages and disadvantages of being in the private setting and being in the public setting that sort of meant something to you?
Well, first things first, and in looking at it from my company's perspective, my company was a public company before it was private, and I joined about 6 months after the company was brought private. And it's slightly different in that my company is also owned by a public company, so there is still some of that public company rigor. But even from the tone from the top and the CEO will say this, and I've had this experience in the past where my prior company divested half of the company into a private company, and you'll see that and hear that sense from the business around a relaxation of not being quarterly driven. So same point to the prior point, in that you suddenly have more freedom to operate, more freedom to have innovation, more freedom to do things with the business that you wouldn't have in a public company because you have that reporting. So from a sales perspective, from what do I do with my money and my innovation and from my development, the business will feel a sense of having that opportunity to invest and to do things with the money within the business and with resources in the business, and really see that as an advantage because you don't have that investor scrutiny, that stakeholder scrutiny. And so lots of advantages in terms of that public reporting that are seen from being a private company. the disadvantages that I would see, and particularly from a legal and compliance perspective, is that you have that relaxation in the rigor. You don't have that regular cadence of the board meetings. There's perceptions, and even coming into the company, there was a perception, and I had a nice handover from the prior public company general counsel of, oh, well, you don't need a lot of those compliance resources. In fact, there were no compliance resources. You don't need the company secretarial. Well, in fact, you do need a lot of those resources. A view in terms of perceptions, and some of those perceptions may be real, some are not, in terms of not needing a lot of those legal and compliance resources, or not needing to do things that actually you might still need to do. And in fact, being a UK company, as for example, the UK actually passed a law in the last year saying that large private companies in the UK have to follow these new governance rules. Some of them are referred to as the Waits principle, saying you actually have to act more like a public company in the UK. So dealing with this from a legal perspective, when you're a public company, those laws are very clear. The SEC regulations are very clear. When you're a private company, dealing with those perceptions of being more relaxed versus having to deal with some of these compliance aspects, we now talk about, things as you might be leading more towards, areas of perhaps wanting to be a public company again, acting more like a public company before you are one, because you don't want to lose that rigor, which is quite important to have even when you're a private company.
That makes sense to me. I often say the SEC rules are both your friend and your foe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what have you done, Carolyn, and what would other private company GCs potentially do from your perspective? And not even GCs, just in-house folks in the GC community, if they think that they may want to prepare, either because they may fall into or they want to get ready because they intend to become a public company general counsel. What are some of the things that you've done and seen other people do that make sense to you to sort of get ready and position yourself?
Well, one, I think talking about serving the customer, serving the stakeholder, having good conversations, again, back to acting like a public company before you are one. When you talk in language about ease of business, doing things and keeping good reporting books and records are always good for the business. When you talk about serving your stakeholder or creating that ease of business and speaking in a language that is good for your client, I think it always helps you to relay the message. When you talk about compliance, that's not always something that immediately rings a bell of, let me spend more time with the legal department. But I think when you talk about why compliance is good for the business and serves the customer, that's something that may want people to spend a little bit more time with you. And when you talk about, I had a great conversation with somebody, I think there's some folks from Cadence perhaps on the line today. I had a great conversation with a senior person in that team recently where they had read a book from a professor at Stanford where they talked about essentialism. And I think these days when we talk about what can the legal department do to serve the business, that essentialism really rings true with me, because you want to talk about what is the value that we provide to the business. And essentialism is, I think, ringing true very, very clearly for me. We talk about contracts management systems, that transparency that we provide to the business. Having long legal contracts that are full of legalese is not actually serving the business, but providing transparency and ease of business, being able to pull up contracts readily so that they're available, getting ready for an IPO so that we can talk about valuations and how the legal department provides a strong valuation proposition for the business, are all things that are great for our stakeholders.
So Carolyn, some private companies, like the one I worked in, are owned by families. Others are owned by private equity firms. Yours is owned by a public company, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But how do the owners and the company's size impact a private company general counsel like yourself?
Well, ultimately, it all comes down to the reporting that you have to do. And, you know, in a public Japanese company, we do JSOX reporting. There's also the questions that your board will ask you or the stakeholders ask you. These days, we hear a lot in the news about the questions that our employees ask us, and that ultimately is going to rise up to the questions that our board and our stakeholders ask of us. We get a lot of questions in this UK private company reporting. Also comes down to the questions that we have to answer in order to be compliant or to be a good compliant company. So this is the stuff that the general counsel has to drive for the company and make sure that we are doing the right reporting, and also really helps our executive committees and our employees understand the transparency that we have to provide for the company. So ultimately, I think whether you are a public company or a large private company, the general counsel has a critical role in managing the governance for the company and making that as easy and as smooth and as compartmentalized and having the right cadence for the board reporting. It doesn't matter whether it's a public company or a private company, we are responsible for that board reporting and for managing that good governance process.
Thank you. John, I think it would be great if you could jump in here, because you mentioned to me that owners are sometimes a factor when a private company general counsel comes to you seeking a different placement. So can you tell us some thoughts about ownership, family-owned, private equity-owned, public company-owned, and what are you hearing from people who want to change roles?
That's interesting. So we do get general counsel that come to us saying, it's time for me to look for something new from a private company. And a lot of times it's because of one of two things. One, either the company strategy or the direction that the owner and or the immediate leadership team are looking to take, the GC just can't get their arms around the strategy, or the risk tolerance of the owner goes in a direction that the GC just doesn't feel comfortable with. And it's incredible. I've actually seen a number of times. So as you mentioned, there's many different types of private companies. We're talking about one that is family owned, but I've seen a lot of people that go to a company thinking it's going to be a great job, and it's sold to them as a great job. And then after they get there, the shield comes down, the curtain opens, and they find out it's a very different culture than they really expected it to be. I think my recommendation is if someone's going to be interviewing, especially on a family-owned company, you really need to dig into the culture and really need to understand that from the different members of the executive team. And you hope that they're going to be honest and candid with you about that. But that is a big concern. As far as money goes, money comes into play sometimes, but most times, most money comes into play where people say, I'm looking for something different to make more money. But for the most part, it tends to be either a cultural misfit or a risk tolerance misfit, one or the other.
That makes a lot of sense. So Carolyn, my initial final question for you is, what is the impact on a private company general counsel if a private company intends to do an IPO and go public?
So this is when, those 6 points, which are always applicable, but that John mentioned at the beginning of the call, really go into high gear. I think it's an incredible opportunity for a private company general counsel to have that opportunity to become a public company general counsel. It's not a given that the private company general counsel will have that role. And I think the private company general counsel should assume that there is going to be an assessment, as would the rest of the executive committee of that company. So, you're going to have to assume that there's going to be that role assessment. You have to assess the rest of your team. You should assume that there's going to be some development gaps and some role gaps. And then assuming that that is done and that you are assessed to be somebody that is going to be able to fit the role, you're going to be part of an IPO roadmap committee. You're going to be working very closely with the CFO. You're going to be looking at things like SOX compliance and other types of governance compliance. You're going to have to be really working very closely with that roadmap committee to prepare for what is going to be a very exciting opportunity. It's been, publicly announced that ARM is intending to do an IPO. We have a fairly long roadmap to be able to do that. So that's something that is very much top of mind for me right now. And it's a pretty exciting time for us.
So John, while we're on IPOs, let's talk a little bit from your perspective. How important is initial public offering experience?
Well, it depends on the situation. If you're going to a private company that especially if it's a private equity owned entity, then the IPO experience is very important. I actually just finished the conversation with the executive team for a portfolio company, the $200 million company looking to go to $600 million to $1 billion in the next 5 years. And their objective is to either flip it to another private equity company or go public. So the 4 candidates that I presented today all had experience either bringing a company to or through an IPO, or they had direct deal experience taking a company to a point where it could be sold, and it was sold. And the multiple was a good multiple that everyone walked away extremely wealthy. So having that experience taking a company through the process is critically important. And the one thing that comes to my mind as I'm sharing this story is we're talking about difference in compensation between public company and private company. I have plenty of general counsel who are extremely successful doing that multiple times, going to a public company, bringing it to either IPO or sale, and taking the money and going back. It's almost like you take a bit of a step backwards, go to another company that's back in the growth stage, and taking that, again, helping them bring the company to the successful transaction that they're all looking for. So if it is a company where the long-term goal is some sort of change of control or transaction, it's definitely critically important that the person has had that type of experience. So if it's going to work for a large public company or a public company, obviously that's already been done, so that's not that important. But going, especially for these portfolio companies, critically important. The 4 candidates, I presented 5, 4 of the 5 had that experience, and all of those candidates really caught the eye of the CEO and the executive team. The one candidate that didn't, they were the division GC of a large company. Maybe their experience seemed to be a little bit more narrow, but didn't have that deal related experience. They just weren't that excited about them.
Got it. Thank you, John. Well, and by the way, John misspoke. He said public when he meant private, but I think everyone understood what you meant. There are some folks that are sort of serial private company to public company GCs. Post IPO, they go back to the private, and you can make a lot of money doing that. So I now want to encourage folks to ask questions, and Dana from our Barker Gilmore team will take a moment and inventory your questions and try to ask us the most common questions and as many of your questions as possible. So I encourage you, your questions are anonymous if you put them in the Q&A function, and we would be happy to have Dana read your questions and try to answer them. And before we do that, just to give Dana a moment to gather, John, I know you wanted to mention Barker Gilmore's philosophy and encouraging participation in the General Counsel Advantage program.
Exactly. I appreciate the opportunity here. And first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. And we're really proud of the fact that we're able to offer the GC Advantage program to such a large audience. We've kind of gone in different directions with the program. Last year, making it a little bit more just to a much smaller group. This year, we decided we're going to open it up. Our mission around here is we're committed to the advancement of others. We're happy to have, whether it's general counsel, corporate executives, or potential successors, hear content from great people like Carolyn and Michelle. We hear often compliments about the content, And we really owe all of the content to the people out there in the legal community. And so again, I really want to thank everyone for participating today, and also encourage anyone, if you have an idea or you're interested in participating in one of these panels, just let us know. We're thrilled to have you part of it. And again, positioning more and more people for success. I'll finish on one note that we're extremely proud of. We just finished a research project to look at the Fortune 500 GC appointments from last year, 2019. There were 56 appointments. And one of the things that we were thrilled about was 62% or 35 of those 56 came from inside. So GC succession, as Michelle mentioned, we're very passionate about it, positioning GC to train well, mentor well, and also the successors to position themselves for success is something that we're critically, we have a focus on when we're helping companies build law departments. We're focused on placing people that have all the characteristics in those 6 steps that I mentioned earlier, so that they have potential to ultimately sit in that seat. The other comment I will make, difference between public company, private company, definitely public company is putting, not saying private companies don't, but public companies are putting a significant push on more women and minorities in the general counsel position. And we were thrilled to report that 54% of the new appointees from 2019 were either women or minorities. And one more fact that I think was really intriguing was there were 25 women that replaced, or 25 women that were appointed general counsel last year, and 20 out of the 25 replaced male general counsel. So, I mean, the numbers are evening out as far as equality, and we're thrilled to see that.
Dana, I want to let you ask some of the audience's questions.
All right, so our first question is, if public companies want exposure to the board, but that is typically a GC role, how does a deputy get that experience?
So if a lawyer working in a public company would like exposure to the board, how do they get it if that is typically only the general counsel? Well, I'll start because I had to groom my successor at a public company. I think one of the important things to do if you're in a position of leadership is to organize your team such that more people can get into the boardroom. So, you know, having a different person, for example, supporting the audit committee, and a different person, for example, supporting the compensation committee can sometimes get 2 people into the boardroom. Having a different person working with you on corporate governance than on corporate compliance can sometimes get 2 people into the boardroom. And if you're an individual and you have public company GC aspirations, I would follow John's advice and try to get into positions and scopes of responsibility that connect to the board of directors, even informally. If you can't actually get into the room, do you have, you know, meetings with board members? Do you have conversations with board members? Does the board care about the work that you're doing in some way? And then, Carolyn, I don't know if you have any other thoughts you'd like to add there.
I would concur with everything that you just said, Michelle. I think the opportunities that were presented from my public company experience was very much in that vein. There were people in the corporate teams that had access to certain areas of the board, and from the audit committee perspective, that's where I had exposure as the chief compliance officer. And then there were certain instances in terms of company activity where there were committees or there were certain presentations where there were rotations to be able to have that board kind of access. And from a risk perspective, which I think is ever more the domain of the legal department, there are conversations and there are presentations and committees where there's opportunity to rotate and have that kind of exposure. I mean, certainly litigation, corporate and compliance are the areas where you have that kind of exposure. And it is very much the responsibility of the general counsel to create that kind of exposure. I also think generally the other domain, and certainly in the private company space, there's probably less exposure to the board specifically. There's sometimes those kinds of opportunities, and there's probably less diversity in terms of in the board specifically, and fewer committees. But I personally spend a lot more time, and probably more time now than had historically happened, getting my senior leadership team with exposure to the executive committee. And that's another area to start developing people for that kind of exposure.
Great point. Dana, next question.
Our next question is, it appears that people move around fairly often, every 2 to 3 years. How is this perceived by companies in your experience?
Shall I kick off with that one, maybe?
Sure.
I think there's sometimes different perceptions around that. To me, and there's sort of been a recent conversation even within my team, and I remember early in my career where I was approached by recruiters saying, you know, this is particularly in the technology space, that this was something that was that needed to happen. I think it really depends on whether the development is happening in your company and where the opportunities are. I think everybody has their own individual story. I personally had very robust development conversations with my management throughout my career, and any time that I felt like there was more opportunity to grow, I was able to find those opportunities within my company. It didn't mean that I didn't look externally or didn't have conversations externally, and I fortunately was able to continue to find that development inside my company. I stayed at my last company for 16 years, and a lot of the people at my current company tend to want to stay. I think it's really dependent on where you find the development. I think having an open environment for having development conversations is really important. I think when somebody skips every 2 years, you start to wonder whether or not people are having those open development conversations versus whether or not you're finding those rotational opportunities inside companies as well. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with the person. It may mean there's something wrong with the company. And so I would like to see people be able to find development opportunities inside companies and outside companies. I don't think there's one formula that fits all.
This is John. So the one thing in the our Fortune 500 survey or a research project, we mentioned that 62% of the new general counsel in the Fortune 500 were promoted from within. The average tenure for one of those successors was 13 years. And one of the comments that I often bring people is it takes time to establish those relationships. It's not going to be a 2 or 3 year stint. The other comment is our clients don't like to hear stories. So what that means is the people who bounce around every 2 or 3 years, the clients don't want to know why it was so great for you, such a great idea to bounce around every 2 or 3 years. They don't want to hear the story. They like to see the commitment and the stability. So I do find people do bounce around a lot. What you're not seeing is people bouncing around a lot and landing some of these high paying positions that I'm describing today.
Dana, next question.
Our next question is, John mentioned situations where the GC ended up in a job different than what they had accepted. Could everyone speak to how far a candidate can go trying to find out information about the company to potentially avoid such a situation without offending the company or the CEO? Where does it cross the line from investigation of the opportunity to just too much?
John, you probably have the most experience with this.
Yeah, I mean, while you're in the interview stage itself, it is a real challenge, because if someone tries to turn the table and interview the interviewer on the interview, 90% of the time they will not get the job. So it is a difficult task. What I say is, especially after they've indicated intentions to make an offer, or after you have an offer in hand, it's worth having some heart-to-heart conversations with the CFO or others. You know, it's very fair after you have an offer in hand to go back and want to set up some different calls or lunches or whatever with some of the members of the team, and really hold them maybe even outside the office where they can speak freely and get some of that. So that would be my recommendation. I will say that, again, just so everyone is clear about that, trying to interview the team and go dig too deep prior to having an offer in hand tends to not work.
The one thing I might add to what John said, that it was just maybe reiterating something he said earlier in the conversation. You know, I think for all of us, this matters. Who you work with is so important, and it's what also makes you want to come into work every day. Of course, the job itself, what the company does, how much you get paid is so critical. But one of the reasons why I stayed at my last job for 16 years was because of the people that I worked with every day, and because I liked my boss so much. We always say, right, people leave managers is more than they leave their jobs. And when I interviewed for my last job, the CEO actually interviewed, the first interview I had with him, he asked so many questions about who I was as a person, more than he asked about my experience. I think he sort of figured, the recruiters had done their jobs and, figured out, whether or not I was a good lawyer. And he spent more time asking me questions about my record on corporate social responsibility and about diversity. And clearly people, we tell these things to our kids, but your social media account kind of matters. I think there is that question about the job itself, but that question about who you're going to be working with on an executive team every day. I ask questions about, how do you manage, your conversations when you disagree? Those kinds of things really do matter as well. And then you can get into how do you think the job is actually going to be executed. So I think what John said at the very beginning about those EQ questions and how people work are really, really important.
Yeah, I'd also like to add, I don't find a large epidemic of this happening, so I don't think people need to be overly paranoid. I did, admittedly, I was blindsided where the culture that was sold to me by the CEO and the CHRO, it turned out to be very different when the candidate showed up. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen because I've experienced it firsthand. But in all my years, that was the first time that's ever actually happened to me personally. So it can happen. You get some people that are just really great salespeople at the executive level, and they can sell you in the wrong direction. It's just very unusual. As Carolyn just saying, you have to really like and trust the people that you're working with. And if you walk into a relationship and the trust isn't there because you were misled, it's a real unfortunate situation. So it certainly can happen, but again, it's not an epidemic of it. So the other thing is I benchmark how good a company is to work for based on how long people are sticking around. And if you see that the executive team has been in place working together for quite some time, you can rest assured that they're all on the same page and they're probably all driven by the same mission.
Dana, we'll take another question.
Our next question is, for either public or private, is there a particular legal background that is more advantageous or beneficial than others? On the flip side, is there an area of law that is an absolute must? For instance, could someone become a GC without any experience in employment law?
Well, I'll start on that one. Yes, you could become a GC without any experience in employment law. I don't think there is a formula. Different companies have different priorities. That's part of why we're having this webinar, is that, there are different ownership structures, there are different company size, there are different industries. So having been the general counsel of GAP, it was very helpful that I had some experience in managing our employment law function, but there are many companies where employment law would not have been as important because they don't have over 100,000 employees. So what is critical at your particular company or at a company you might be interested in may be different depending on the industry, the regulatory framework, and many other factors, including whether it's public or private, who the ownership is, what the size of the company is. I would not say there's something that is absolutely essential. For example, my predecessor at GAP was a litigator by background. I was a corporate lawyer by background, and my successor was an intellectual property lawyer by background. So I think that gives a good example of 3 GCs at public companies, 2 of us for 10 years, and 1 is 4 years in and doing a great job, and we all have very different backgrounds.
All right.
So maybe we should move on.
Yes. Our next question is, what are your thoughts about how to develop relations with directors?
Carolyn, do you have any thoughts there? I don't want to keep talking too much. That's a tough one. I think we may have lost Carolyn.
We may have lost her.
I think, yeah, my computer muted itself. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, sorry. It did that all on its own.
It was a hard question, too.
Yeah. So my experience has actually been very different at the public company and private company. So, it was essential, had a dotted line report to the audit committee chair when I was at a public company. There's a little more diversity on the, the board at the public company, and at SoftBank has, of course, many companies as a board. And so the relationship in developing relationships with the board is quite different. Frankly, it was a little bit easier to develop relationships with board members at the public company because I think there was just a little bit more of a dedication to the particular board, and to the company in the public, in the public company that it is now in the private company. Interestingly enough, I would expect in some private companies that's a little bit different. I obviously have closer relationships with the board members that are on the ARM side than on some of the SoftBank side. So I think there's some areas where you might develop a relationship with certain board members that have a closer relationship, for instance, on the audit committee, or that have certain particular interests that are shared with some of the work that you are doing. And I think it's really important for the general counsel to have those relationships where there's more of an interface. And so audit committee is one area where I think the general counsel or the chief compliance officer has a particularly close relationship.
One thing, I'll jump in here and just say one thing is what I found from people who are not the general counsel, but they have some sort of access to the board, is when you're asked by a board member to do something, be incredibly thorough, be incredibly fast, responsive with what they're looking for. And if you do that, they will come back to you more and more and more. So that relationship and the outreach will grow. So if ever given the opportunity, don't screw it up.
All right, our next question is, do you believe internal candidates are sometimes disadvantaged relative to external candidates, especially when a CEO is looking for a change in the legal function, company, and assumes internal candidates may represent the status quo? What are some tips for internal candidates in convincing interviewers they do not represent the status quo?
John, you've had good luck at this, so why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I will say that, first of all, I think that's a dynamite question. If the general counsel today isn't perceived as a strategic advisor and really doesn't have the trust and confidence of the executive team, they will have exactly that idea about the rest of the members of the law department. So it's very challenging for someone to get promoted from within if that's the case. And the CEOs will come to me and say, I definitely need someone who can come in and change the law department. So the name of the game there is you need to be aligned with a general counsel that you have as much trust and confidence in as the board and the executive team. And if that's the case, think about packing up, because go somewhere else, because it's not going to happen. I think that answered the question, but that's the reality.
Well, and I'll just add, because as some of the folks on the webinar know, but many probably don't, I am now an executive coach to general counsel, and I have coached a few people through the internal succession process. And in several of those cases, it was important to show the difference between the current GC, where there was tension with the board, or with the current GC and the CEO. If there is that tension, either with the board or the CEO, if there's both, it's probably not going to happen, more along the lines of what John's saying. But if there is a supportive board but not a supportive CEO, or a supportive CEO and not a supportive board, I think that's a hurdle that you can get over. but it's something you're really going to have to work at, and you're going to have to show exactly what John said, that you are different. You are the strategic advisor. And it's a pretty tough challenge, but I have seen it successfully done in 2 cases.
Yeah, the one other strategy that just occurred to me though is that maybe you won't get the GC seat this time around, but if somebody comes in and you work closely with that new person, then obviously that person can reposition you for that potential succession role. So I guess I have to pull back the idea of pack and run, but because you can resurrect it, but the likelihood of being promoted into that general counsel seat is definitely very slim.
Hey, I might just add sort of an alternative story too, in that, you know, being in a succession round, and you know, I was in a position once where there was a CEO that was very supportive of a succession plan. And, you know, I think it's really good to ask for feedback. And I, you know, asked for feedback and said, what would be my development plan and how would I get there? And that CEO was very supportive. And then that CEO left. And so you can't always count on that CEO always being in the seat if you're waiting for it. So I think when you're thinking about your career and you're thinking about your development, always consider, you know, do you feel developed and do you feel like that opportunity is there, but don't necessarily wait for it. So as long as you feel like you're getting development opportunity, and as long as you feel like you're on that path, that's a good thing, but don't necessarily wait for it.
Great point.
Our next question is, how important is management of other attorneys and persons important for becoming a GC, public or private?
Well, I'll start by saying that it really depends if the role of the GC is primarily a business leadership role or if it's a practicing law role. So for example, I was working in a private company where I was the only in-house lawyer, and it was very much a practicing law, solo contributor, individual contributor job. At a large public company like Gap, I had a legal team of 120 people, and having the leadership skills to manage those people was essential to establish. So I think that my point is, we are using the title General Counsel as if it's one thing. In reality, it could be everything from a solo person practicing law in a small company to a large company with 1,000-person legal compliance and risk department.
Our next question is, do companies focus on recruiting GCs from the same industry? Am I pigeonholed unless I have been in-house on different industries?
John, you're probably best to take a stab at that one.
Well, I will say that it depends on the industry. The most highly regulated industries, for example, financial services, healthcare, energy, it's pretty challenging to come from a completely different sector and become the general counsel. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. And again, my number one rule is you can't stereotype anything. As Michelle said, people come from every type of discipline and any type of, whether it's a government regulator or a law firm partner or an in-house counsel, they can come from anywhere to get these jobs. But the number one thing that most of my clients come to us looking for is direct industry experience. Having multiple industry experience is even a bigger, I think it's even more beneficial. It shows that you are able to adjust from different businesses. We have a couple of clients now that specifically said to us, we don't want someone who's just done this one thing. So they like to see a little bit of a mix. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the bouncing around in many different sectors and doing so without very long tenure at any one company is never a good thing. So having multiple industry experiences is great. Yes, clients do tend to want someone in their own industry.
Our next question is, have you found that well-established public companies are more open to take a chance on hiring a first-time GC versus pre-IPO startups?
John, that may be you again.
No, the pre-IPO startup would definitely be more apt to hire someone who's not a sitting GC. And as I said, the CEO or the executive team or the board, for the most part, their preference would always be for someone who's not learning on the job and has run a law department. where the open-mindedness of, you have to look at, especially if you're looking at a pre-IPO company, the salaries are going to be lower. There's going to be a bigger payout in the end, but the salaries are going to be lower. So it's not going to be as easy to attract someone who's sitting in a similar position with another company, unless they just went through a transaction, as I mentioned, and they're willing to go back and do it again. So yeah, the pre-IPO company is going to be more interested or more open to a non-sitting GC than the public company. But that said, as the results of our research showed, the GC does not necessarily. Only 23% of those coming from the outside this year were sitting general counsel. So it can come from anywhere.
So Dana, I think we may be out of time. So let me say that we appreciate your participation today. If you're interested in Barker Gilmore supporting you in your career, you can contact any of us via the Barker Gilmore website, barkergilmore.com. And we are pleased to offer General Counsel Advantage webinars on a periodic basis, and we hope you will continue to participate.
And if anyone's looking for one of the most dynamic coaches or advisors out there, Michelle Banks is the #1 in the nation, and I'm not even joking with that comment. I'm not exaggerating. So if anyone's interested, we'd love to have a chat with you about our advisor services.
Thank you, and have a good day, and thanks again to Carolyn for taking time to be with us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.